Welcome to Taller Together, where I know you'll leave a little taller than when you arrived. I'm your host, Tamsin Lovell, and today we're joined by Polish-born British artist Maciej Urbanek, trained at the Royal Academy Schools in London. Maciej's work is rooted in photography, but it unfolds across installation, sculpture, and printmaking, often transforming ordinary materials like plastic bags even into large-scale abstract images that question how we see reality. His monumental work, HS, at St. Michael's Church in Camden, won the ACE Award for Art in a Religious Context, and he has taught photography and printmaking at the Royal Academy while running his own Urbanek gallery. Maciej now works internationally, including projects in Amsterdam, recent commissions in Abu Dhabi, and an exhibition this month at PEX in Hungary. A feature article in Armature magazine, out now, describes his practice as borderless, not just geographically, but materially. Maciej, we are delighted to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us, and I believe you're in Abu Dhabi right now.
Thank you very much for having me, Tamsin. It's a pleasure.
Is it hot in Abu Dhabi?
It's mid-November right now. The weather is actually turning beautiful in Abu Dhabi after the scorching heat of the summer when it's really difficult to be outside. Now it's cooler and more pleasant, and it's the start of the year. A lot of events around town. It's actually beautiful. I'm happy to be here.
You seem to have developed this adaptability to different climate, different light, different stimulus of the places that you move and work in, which we'll get into a little bit later, because I think it informs that continuous questioning that is part of your practice. But for listeners meeting you for the first time, how would you briefly introduce who you are and what you make now, especially this shift from straight photography into hybrid installations, abstract works, and large-scale prints? Maybe you could walk us through one current project, perhaps what you're currently doing in Abu Dhabi, your commission there, or and talk about the single most important decision that shaped how you approached this particular project in practice.
It was very interesting to me, and I was very happy that you described my practice as borderless, because in many aspects I feel like that, not only as far as my art is concerned, but as far as my life is concerned. I was born in Poland, but by the age of 7, I lived in 4 different countries. I spent time in Greece and ended up in the United States, where my family emigrated towards the end of a period of communism in Poland. I grew up later on between Poland, where I went to school, and United States, where I spent most of the holidays and free time. I kind of feel at home everywhere and not really at home anywhere. It has its advantages and disadvantages. I think the advantages is the adaptability and feeling comfortable in different conditions, feeling comfortable at different places and surrounded by different people. And maybe disadvantages is the feeling of restlessness and not being able to fully assign myself anywhere. I started my college level education in Poland. I actually went to law school in Poland for 6 years. I did my undergraduate and postgraduate studies in law, and I specialized towards the end of it in theory of human rights, and more specifically in theory of human rights relating to culture and cultural heritage of humankind. So that gave me quite a strong theoretical basis and a strong, I guess, view on culture and the role of art in humans' life. And while I was studying law, I actually started studying history of art, and that was quite an important moment for me when I realized that art is where I should put my effort and my energies. When I graduated with my MA in law, I applied to study in art in London, and I got accepted to Goldsmiths College, where I did fine art and history of art. And after that, I studied in the Royal Academy of Arts for my postgraduate diploma for another 3 years. My higher education adventure was quite long. And sometimes I feel like I was a little bit institutionalized. But at the same time, I feel it gave me a really broad view on art, on history of art, on visual culture, and on cultural criticism. I think that my education in London and Goldsmiths College and Royal Academy of Arts was really crucial in a lot of ways because it gave me insight into two quite different attitudes or aspect of art production and art practice. Goldsmiths College it's a quite a left-leaning and politically aware and engaged institution that instilled in me a view on art production as production of knowledge. And that's kind of how I approach my own practice and how I look and analyze or approach art practices of others. Goldsmith presented to me a whole huge, wide spectrum of different media approaches to contemporary art production and what it means to be an artist. And after I graduated from Goldsmiths, I went to the Royal Academy. That is the oldest art school in Britain and one of the oldest in Europe. It was kind of a different end of the spectrum because it's quite conservative, or it used to, or it perceived to be quite conservative. It's actually quite forward thinking.
I remember when you were tutoring there and you gave me a tour of the Royal Academy, I was very impressed with the facilities.
It gave me an insight into the art market, patrons, funding, and opportunities that became really quite important and significant in my later development as an artist. I graduated from the Royal Academy in 2010, and by then my practice was centered around digital photography and digital printmaking. And I was honored with receiving a gold medal that year, which is given by the faculty of the Royal Academy for the graduation exhibition to one of the students. And I was invited to become a tutor in the Royal Academy. And I worked in the Royal Academy as the first photography tutor in its history for the next 10 years. And that was a very significant experience for me because I worked one day a week, having access to students and new ideas, new practices, and the vibrant environment of the school. And the rest of the week I was devoting to my studio practice. It was a really great balance between constantly having access to the really vibrant flow of ideas and attitudes and discussions and so on, and being able to work on my own practice and on the development of my own trajectory through the art world.
Can you tell us a little bit about the current project in Abu Dhabi? Because I think that it'll be interesting for our listeners to hear about that shift that you made from that more studio photography practice into these large installations and these kind of abstract works and diversifying across mediums. What is it that you're currently doing in Abu Dhabi?
What I'm doing in Abu Dhabi is the result of the presentation of my work at Unseen Art Fair I did last year. Unseen is a leading fair of contemporary photography in Europe, and coinciding with Unseen, there is an exhibition put on called Unbound, and the exhibition showcases large-scale projects in photography that offer a new angle or new understanding of the photographic medium. And the director of the art fair and the curator of the Unbound exhibition, Roderick van der Lee, invited me to show a work called Sunflower in the exhibition. Sunflower is a work belonging to a group of works I called Garbage Baroque. And those works are the result of my year-long exploration of the photographic medium. Relating back to your question about the shift from analog photography to digital photography, I feel like in my art practice, I went through all the steps on the development of photography, starting from 35 millimeter cameras, developing film and exploring darkroom wet processes through digital photography, which I picked up at the beginning of my undergraduate studies. And I picked up digital photography because at the time I really needed a medium that would allow me to process my ideas quickly. I was doing large-scale drawings at the time. They would take 2 or 3 weeks to execute each drawing. And I really needed a medium that would keep up with everything that I was thinking and all the ideas and all the concepts that were running through my head with the speed of light, and digital photography allowed me to do exactly that. Within digital photography, I started from straightforward photography, i.e. photographing things and then printing them. Then I started applying digital post-production or processing in the smaller and then larger degrees, like, for instance, combining positives and negatives that became a big feature of a lot of bodies of work that I created. And then I, in the pursuit of the possibilities that photography offer, I started using photography as a part of the process of creating work along with other media. In the Garbage Baroque series that the Sunflower work belongs to, I utilized garbage bags. I used garbage bags to create a large-scale sculptures or reliefs covering big areas, several meters by several meters, where I scrunched and twisted and pulled garbage bags, attaching them to the walls. And then I would create a very specific lighting conditions for these installations. And then I would take photographs of the installations. And then I would take elements of these photographs to create digitally symmetrical or kaleidoscopic designs. And then I would print those designs often in large scale. In this latest series of works, photography became one step or one element of a very long and complex process that results in the print. And in fact, you're looking at the photograph of the garbage bags, but the image itself escapes this type of categorization and becomes more like a painting or a detailed drawing. That was the trajectory within the photography that I had. And I had a quite wonderful and positive response to those works, to the works I presented in the Unseen Art Fair. I had a bit of press coverage, and that's how I ended up getting in touch with the curators working in Abu Dhabi, who asked me to execute smaller scale works for collectors here.
It's amazing your courage, I think, to open yourself up to pushing the boundaries of your practice, pushing the boundaries of the medium that you were trained in, traveling across different geographies, relocating your home. And I suppose that came from all of that movement you had to do as a youngster. But that courage, I think, is interesting. And I think it enables you to do your own thing without worrying about trends or fashion. And you've spoken about kind of current fashion, if you like, of figurative, story-driven painting and your own commitment to non-narrative, sensation-led abstraction. When you think about museums and corporate or private collections trying to build resilient programs today, what are one or two practical ways that curators or collectors can support the more experimental or abstract practices without losing audiences who expect that clear kind of story from every artwork?
Okay. And thank you very much for calling me courageous. I don't definitely feel like that, but it's really nice to hear that. A duality of trying to follow my own instinct and creating a childlike curiosity towards, and then following that instinct to execute work or to explore certain idea, and then trying to look back at it critically using all the knowledge and the experience that I have and basically assess it and build on that. I think that's my process almost of push and pull between the curiosity and knowing territory and then trying to call it or name it or categorize it and wrap it up with all the cultural capital that I can. As far as the current situation in the art world, I think it's quite interesting in a lot of ways because there is a real plurality of voices within the art world. And I don't think that historically we ever had a situation like that. I think we're used to having a center or a dominant voice in the art history. Before the Second World War, it was Paris. After Second World War, it was New York and United States. And this dominant voice is usually with Western culture and of patriarchal type of power structures. And in the last decades, this model or this situation has been really changing because many other voices that were sidelined or underrepresented are coming to the front, and all the voices of different racial groups and women and artists who were perceived naive or primitive in the past now are being put on the same level and regarded as equal with what used to be perceived as a dominant voice. It's a really good situation, but it's a situation that poses a certain difficulty because it's very hard to put value or to make judgments about certain practices or certain stories that art are telling. And with the situation of, relativity almost, fashions play quite a big role. I can see the art world being maybe favoring at the moment certain type of figurative art and certain type of painting presenting an atmospheric landscape, often private spaces and the characters inhabiting it. That reflects in auction sales and the interest from the art market. But at the same time, I feel, as I said, that there is almost room for everyone. I'm not being particularly concerned. I try to stay focused on what I'm interested in and what I want to explore. I think that, and relating to the question that you had about museums or collections making decisions as far as what to get involved in, I think it depends on the motivation of the institutions or corporations or private individuals, whether those decisions are led, again, by curiosity or interest in helping artists, or whether they're led by interest in investment. So it's almost like cultural capital versus actual capital or money. It depends on the institution, and then I guess this motivation and the context would then point to the decision-making process, if you know what I mean. It'll be easy for me to answer this question from the point of view of the artist who makes art. And I can talk about that because, obviously there are practical ways that collectors can support works. And, there's, as you said, a practical aspect to the armature that has to do mostly with money and the investment. What I feel is the most important in the adventure and the project of collecting art is honesty and integrity on the part of people who collect. Always advise people, if I'm in a situation like that, to invest in things that they like or things that speak to them and the things that they find interesting. And without sort of calculated attitude of return in the future. Because I found that if you follow your gut, to say, your heart, as far as decision making in terms of collecting or choosing what to support, you always come up on the winning side. Even if the artwork or the artist doesn't sort of conquer the art market and the prices don't go through the roof, you always end up with that you find interesting or that relates to you and that you like.
Yes. And you spoke about these power structures changing and almost fragmenting and diversifying, which is really, really interesting for me. And in terms of what I do as the founder of Artfundi, which is a comprehensive, secure art management solution built for museums and galleries and corporate collections, etc. We often, in that context, talk about armature as a more technical support structure around art. But there are so many, and the Armature magazine is about exploring all of those support structures or underlying infrastructures, if you like, both cultural capital, people's values, the support that art is provided or not provided, and the technology which is increasing around the world. I want to dive in a little bit into that now and talk with your experience as an artist from a technological point of view, especially your advanced printing techniques, digital image kind of workflows, and teaching at the Royal Academy as their first photography tutor. Could you think of 2 or 3 concrete habits that you would urge artists and institutions to adopt now, whether around metadata or archiving or production, that would protect the long-term life of artworks that are in these newer mediums or larger scale formats that they might not be as familiar with as the more traditional artworks?
If you preserve this integrity and honesty, it's a always win-win situation. And I think that it's good to be brave in supporting art that not necessarily is traditional or not necessarily uses traditional media or traditional ways, because it feels, I guess that, painting oil on canvas would be the most traditional and kind of entrenched type of art that seems to be holding value and importance. The more ephemeral media and ephemeral practices that are focused on ideas or emotions rather than on the material aspects of their execution can hold longevity and energy beyond their material status. Again, I'm referring back to this idea of production of knowledge. If that would be the guideline for collecting art or for institutions or museums, I think that it will always kind of translate into really good decisions. I'm not sure if this answers your question in terms of, in terms of technical issues. Now, there is such a plethora of possibilities that are widening the scope of artistic modes of expression. For instance, when I started in the Royal Academy in 2007, we were just starting to establish really high-end professional digital printmaking. It was supported by, we got large-scale printers, different papers, and different substrates to print on. And various students were experimenting with printing on rubber, textiles, and newsprint, and on. And by the time that I was a tutor in the Royal Academy of around 2015-16, 3D printmaking became really widespread and really applied to a lot of practices, that even 10 years prior was completely inaccessible, now became a very common way of executing sculpture, creating models, and on. This benchmark is being put forward more and more and more. There is augmented reality area where we had workshops in the Royal Academy with companies that produce for artists to create sculptures in virtual reality and plan everything in virtual reality and then test the ideas out, so it's really amazing what technology offers. And the validity of those means or medium kind of holds ground, it doesn't expire. So as much as you can make a masterpiece with pen and paper, now you can also make a masterpiece with artificial intelligence, augmented reality, 3D printing, and so on. So that's an amazing sort of situation for artists to be in, and also quite daunting because so many possibilities and so many choices give pressure of making those choices.
You're an example, I think, to other artists in terms of that. To go back to my kind of question about 2 or 3 concrete habits for artists and institutions, for me, those would be things like, as you spoke about, the being very cognizant of the motivations for both art making and art collecting, and being brave, being experimental, opening yourself up. It's true for both artists and for the institutions that are supporting those artists. It comes down to mindset. It's about developing for yourself as an artist or as an institution, developing a leadership mindset, which will ensure that both the values and the technical systems and the infrastructure systems in the art world actually serve artists rather than kind of quietly constraining them. I love how you have brought that down to a sense of bravery rather than conservatism.
I opened a gallery in London, and apart from showing my own work unashamedly in my own gallery, I decided to support other artists, giving them shows. It's either my colleagues from Royal Academy or from Goldsmiths, and my students, current students at the time, and ex-students. And I would give them most often the first show in their career. And I found this deeply satisfying. It wasn't a commercial project. It was purely supporting other people's practices and giving them the platform to show their work. And I realized that there were two kind of most important aspects of this, of my role in this scenario. First was to give the artist total freedom and give them a completely, carte blanche as to what they want to do in the gallery and how they want to present it. Because from my own experience, I realized that this freedom is in a very good way connected to responsibility of creating something really individual and taking the reign of your own art and the process of showing it to people. It's on one hand a very necessary aspect of art production, showing the work, and at the same time quite daunting because it's exposing and the artists feel vulnerable. And the second part of my role in showing other people's work was to reassure them. I think that artists really struggle with doubt. And again, it's a good thing and a bad thing, because doubting, it actually pushes you forward in this exploration and unknown territory, which is always generative of new ideas, encounters, and discoveries. Doubting is a burden because you second guess and question yourself. In my function as an organizer of exhibitions for others, I felt that museums and collectors do with making their decisions. They're giving a huge boost of confidence and they're giving the huge kind of seal of approval for artists that what they do is worthwhile, is noticed, and is important. I think in terms of leadership, I think that kindness and openness really pays off.
I love that. And it's such an important thing that you've done. You probably don't understand the ripples that you've put out there in the world from giving artists those opportunities and support, being their first piece of structural support as they step from an academy and into the real world of art.
Oh, I hope, I really hope. I don't think about it like that. I have quite a practical attitude towards these things. In my mind, it was, I have a space, it's empty at these particular times. I want you to take advantage of it. I think practicality and taking advantage of opportunity is a big part as well of what I do and what I recommend to people.
You're right. But you just have a sense. It's a little bit like what I'm doing with Armature. You have a sense of bigger that you can start. You can put out there and start. And it's through the collaboration of people who come on board, who say, yes, I'll have that conversation with you and we'll put it out there together, like you and I are doing right now, to just start like that and say, I think it needs to be started. I don't know where exactly it's going, but
definitely.
Let's just do it and see what happens.
Well, you know what I always say, that the difference between artists and people who are not artists is that artists do art and the other people don't. It's just a matter of actually doing, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes, Maciej. If we think about books, one of the things I've introduced in the magazine is a book review, which we're going to have in every issue. Can you think about a book about creativity or business or anything that you can recommend to our listeners?
You know what? I really like biographies. Biographies are my favorite type of books, along with historical books. And I really like reading biographies of artists. And there is a for that. And the most recent couple books that I read, one is called Ninth Street Women by Mary Gabriel. And it's a biography, or it's a book about 5 abstract women painters: Lee Krasner, John Mitchell, Elaine de Kooning, Grace Hartigan, and Helen Frankenthaler. And it's a book about the post-war art environment in United States, in New York primarily, describing the lives and artistic practices of these women, and of a whole group of other artists who they were in touch or, interacting with, Poland and, others, of course. And I like reading the biographies of artists because having a broader context of how art is created, where it comes from, what of environment it is being produced in, and what of people surround it, really takes away the myth, in a way, of artist and art production. I'm myself a victim of this myth. Very often I would look at an artwork or the artist not knowing much about them and feeling a certain pang of jealousy about how amazing their life must have been and how successful they were and so on. But very often you or I forget or completely disregard the whole background of toil and trouble and issues that surround the creation process or biography of a certain artist. If you think of Pollock, who is one of the most important, esteemed artists of the 20th century, his biography and his life was actually quite tragic. And in his life, he enjoyed maybe 3 years of success. And then he kind of fell out of favor a bit. Knowing artists' biographies and their background gives me a better perspective on my own efforts and my own aspirations and ambitions. Similar with another book I read recently, it was called Chalk, The Art and Erasure of Cy Twombly by Joshua Rifkin. And it was a really interesting biography because I always really loved Cy Twombly and his work, but I didn't really know a lot about who he was. And I must say it was a real surprise to me to read about the difficulties of his character, and this kind of changes and broadens the perspective on those subjects. I would encourage artists to maybe read a bit about the artists they like and their biography and their life trajectory. It's helpful to then be at peace with your own life art scenario.
That's such good advice, because we all subscribe to the kind of one sentence story, and it's usually just the end. Make us much more appreciative, not just of that artist that we admire so much, their story, but our own, because we can see the real grit which we live every day. And then
it helps you to be just relaxed, just it's fine, do your things. I used to be obsessed about, because when I was studying law, I at this point quite early on, I started to feel, oh my God, am I losing time? Am I doing the right thing? And I was sort of obsessed about reading artist biographies and trying to find out at what age they started doing art. I was comparing myself like crazy. I remember being stressed out knowing that, some artists started at 14 or 15 or 16. But then I read the biography of Kandinsky, who was a lawyer before he started art, and he started studying art in his 30s. Now it's like, okay, it's fine. I'm not losing any time.
Then there are others in their 70s, Granny Moses or whoever else.
Totally.
There's no time limit, but you've nailed the thing, this sense of time, because these sort of snippet stories that we subscribe to tend to truncate time into this little thing where we look at it and go, wow, they're an overnight success. But when you read the biographies, that's a real sense that I always get from them, is how long things actually take in everybody's life to be successful or to build or to get a breakthrough. There's so much you have to go through to get to the breakthrough, and that always takes time. Who gave you the best advice you've ever had and you still use today?
You know what? It's a funny question you ask this now, because it totally relates to what we just talked about before. It was a really good friend of mine and a great artist, Eileen Cooper, who was a Royal Academician and who was my teacher at the Royal Academy. And then I worked for several years as her assistant, and then we became very close friends. And at one point, she told me that I always remember that it's when you're able to sustain your practice, you're a successful artist. It's the most important that if you can achieve a point when you can make your work, when you have infrastructure for that, i.e. space, time, money to invest in the materials, but as long as you can sustain that, that already means you're a successful artist. It doesn't mean that you have to have exhibitions in the most prestigious museums in the world. It doesn't mean that you have to be represented by blue chip galleries, which in fact is a curse and a really burden for a lot of artists. But if you're able just to make your work and to follow your curiosity and to spend time with your own creativity, that to me really instills. And I have an attitude that everything is a bonus. I'm already feel very satisfied and happy that I can do what I do, and anything above that is a bonus. I think I really appreciate her and her advice and her work ethics, because she works every day. She paints and prints and she's an amazing person.
That really sticky advice that has lived with you for a long time. In terms of business advice, what's one piece that you would give your 20-year-old self if you could look back?
You have to be entrepreneurial. You have to approach people. You have to not be ashamed to ask for things. You have to be proactive in creating platforms for people. And very often, in most cases, people who could help you are not actively looking to help you, but you have to present yourself to them in order for them to help you, if you know what I mean. So yes. I think that's, I want to say, you shouldn't be networking. I don't feel I'm particularly good at this. I feel like I'm often doing things on my own and my own way, and carving an alternative path for myself. But I think it depends on the temperament and character. But I would definitely say that you should not be ashamed. Just leave the shame, at the door, and just go and be honest with people, be kind, be straightforward, play the numbers game. The more times you try, the more chances of success you have. That's probably the advice that I would give myself then and give myself now as well. I still do it. I still play the numbers game.
And Maciej, if you were an artwork, which would you be and why?
This is, it's an interesting question. And in a way, you could say you would want to be the most famous artwork in the world. You would want to be Mona Lisa. You would want to be this mysterious artwork viewed and admired by everyone and so on. But I think that if I was to choose any artwork to be, it would be one of my artworks or all of my artworks, because I think they are me. They're a product of my intellectual and physical activity and almost like a residue of me. I guess I'm gonna unashamedly say I would be my own artwork.
Thank you so much, Maciej. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you about all borderless things that you're involved in and chatting to you from Abu Dhabi today. Thank you for being with us. I'm going to end on a quote from the article Borderless Practice that was published in issue 1 of Armature magazine. I love this quote, and for me, it reflects the essence of you and what makes you such an exciting artist. You said, "What matters is keeping the questions alive. Art is not about certainty, but about asking again and again in different languages what it means to exist."
Thank you much for the invitation. It was a real pleasure and a real honor to be a part of this podcast. So thank you. Thank you so much.
That's the show. I'm Tamsin Lovell, and this has been Taller Together. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.